much at the heart of what I wanted to talk about today. So thank you for joining us on our broadcast. It's great to have you here. And if you're in Saskatoon, we'd love to have you visit and drop by and join with us. I know you'd love sharing this time with us. So I wanted to start with something a little funny. There was a minister, a religious science minister, who got a horse and he decided to train it. And so what he did was, being a devout minister of religious science, he decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to train it a little differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to train it, instead of saying, giddy up, I'm going to say, and so it is. And instead of going, whoa, I'm going to have one mind. And so he trained that horse. And it was really good because every time he took his horse for a ride, he'd be saying, and so it is, and one mind, and so it is, and one mind. And so he felt this was a great, almost spiritual practice. It was bringing him back. And then one day, though, he's taking his horse out for a ride, and the horse spooks, and it just gallops off. And so he's kind of panicking a little. He's like, okay, stop, whoa, whoa. And then he suddenly remembers, as he's seeing a cliff approach, one mind. So the horse stops, and he's looking over the flanks. He's like, oh, and so it is. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you today about why do I want a church? And I thought this was a pertinent question because for me, when I think about my story of how I came to be here, that's really a big part of my being here is church, is spiritual community. And I realized that as I was approached and asked to consider being a spiritual director, I sort of inquired as to what's happened and what's been going on. I know many of you know me. I've been here before. I've spoken. I've worked with the board. And I had a beautiful opportunity to, as I was going through my ministerial studies, to get lots of practice here, to cut my teeth. My first ever workshop I did here with you guys. And so, a special place in my heart. And I started to ask, and I found out that you guys have been going through as a community, just a wonderful sort of opportunity of growth and evolution. And what I know is that before the sun shines, there's often a storm. There's often some kind of, process of creation that involves things being stirred up, and then you can expand into that. And if you think about your lives, this is typically what happens. So when I thought about what had happened, one of the things that I'd heard was that you decided as a group to have a church. You had a vote and you decided we want to have a church. But what I hadn't heard about was why. Why do you want a church? Because it's one thing to say I want something, but for me, I always like to understand why. I like to get clear on the purpose of anything that I do. I like to get clear on the purpose because I want to connect to the feeling of that. I want to know that when I'm involved with something, that my purpose and the purpose of the group are in alignment, that we can have, I can show up, I can flow into this calling. So obviously as a minister of religious science, which I'm delighted to be now, it's been a wonderful journey for me to be here. And I've gone through a lot of work around purpose. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my story, a little of my story, as to why I have come to realize how much I want church. And it started for me around 2006. I had been doing a bunch of metaphysical inquiry. So I've been looking at all sorts of different modalities, and as a Reiki master, and I was doing therapeutic touch and spiritual healing. I was working with crystals. I was doing mediumship. I was working with tarot cards. I was buying books. I was highlighting the books. I was highlighting more books. And what I found, though, was that I would go into life and I would find myself slipping. I found that I really didn't have a clear anchor. And so around 2006, I'd moved to Edmonton, and we hadn't been there very long. And a friend of mine was telling me about this church. You should really come and see this church. It was the Center of Spiritual Living, Edmonton. And at the time, I thought about it. And as I was thinking about it, I got a call from England because the partner of my mother had just made transition, just passed away. So my mother had just passed away, rather. And so the partner phoned me to say, well, your mother's passed away. And of course, this was a bit of a shock because I found out she'd been ill for 3 months. And I didn't know about it. Now, to give you some context, for a number of years, my mother had been phoning me at, say, 3 in the morning, because of the time difference, I guess, in a bit of an alcoholic rage, telling me what was on her mind at the time. And so I found after a while that it was a real struggle to engage. And so I guess there wasn't that model dutiful son, because I was carrying a lot of pain. But when I heard about my mother making transition, a whole bunch of stuff got stirred up. And I went to England and I saw to the arrangements of her funeral. And of course, you know, it took me a lot of time to work through that. And who knows? I mean, there's so many layers of stuff that we work through in our subconscious that it may be a little while yet before I'm fully done. I don't know. But what happened though was when I came back, I guess I was ready, because that next Sunday, I walked into the Center for Spiritual Living Edmonton. And here's what I found. I walked into a community where I heard a message. And the message that was delivered, it was based on, there's an author called Maria Nemeth, and there's a book called Mastering Life's Energies. And inside there, she talks about God qualities, one of them being vulnerability. Now, I remember at that point, I was hearing a minister say, you know, someone doing spiritual talk, talking about vulnerability and really encouraging and saying, you know, you should look at vulnerability. You should look and see what it is for you. And I was challenged by this because I in my mind, I was going, I don't want to be vulnerable. I want to be strong. I want to be clear. You know, I want to be lively and vibrant. And the minister was challenging that. He was saying something that was bringing some discomfort into my life. And that, as it turns out, was an amazing thing. So I probably wouldn't be here. But that was just the beginning. So what happened then was I had a little bit of a conversation with him, and he pointed out that his understanding of vulnerability was that when you realize that we are this body is a projection of the soul onto this material plane, but this soul is an individualization of spirit, and that you recognize that there's this creative mind and that you are this eternal being. You are going through this eternal journey. When you connect with that knowing of your divinity, you suddenly realize that you are eternal, that you're not defined by the birth date and when you may die. You're not defined when you connect spiritually to that truth by the fear of death. You start to recognize within yourself that we are always going to be alive. Whenever we're dealing with transition, for example, a loved one who's parted, the most beautiful thing we can do is hold it in a loving knowing. Just love the memory of them, love the energy of them, and just honor that with love. So when he was talking about vulnerability from that point of view, it took me a while, but it really started to sort of activate something in me. So the next thing that happened, I got to meet some people in fellowship. So then, you know, after the service, I started to connect with people, started to hear their stories, started to get to know a little bit about them. And fellowship's an interesting experience because we have a little bit of time typically after the service. And what a wonderful thing it is you've moved into this new facility because now you can actually have a more conscious opportunity for fellowship. That's beautiful. That gives you a space within which to start to cultivate and deepen into community. And you may not stay every Sunday, but now you've got this option so you can connect with people. But then the next step after that, and what happened for me was I heard about the classes that were put on. And it was interesting because for many years, I remember going to my first ever church, like an Anglican church in England. And I remember that there was always this sense of I'd look at the priest, the minister, and I'd always be kind of curious. There was something that I could put my finger on it. And I went through a series of churches and denominations, and I always had a curiosity. But when I got into classes, what I started to discover was that we were deepening in to this teaching called the science of mind. And so we would take a book or take an aspect of the teaching or a chapter or chapters out of the science of mind, and we would read them. And we would have questions and homework, and we'd go away, and then we'd come back the next week. And as a group, we would discuss what we'd taken from that. We'd discuss how it had applied in our lives, and we would hear the perspective of others. So what happened in this process was that I got to learn about other people, and they got to learn about me. Now, at that time, the first class I took was Thomas Troward's The Edinburgh Lectures. Anyone here taken the Edinburgh Lectures? Here you have. Those of you that haven't, it's a very interesting read. Because really what it is, it was based on Thomas Troward delivering some lectures in Edinburgh, I think around 1912. And what he was doing was he was delivering, he had spent some 25 years in India as a judge. He was in the Indian civil service. But what he had done is he had connected with the Eastern philosophy. He'd been really curious. And so he'd immersed himself in the culture, and he was naturally curious. And I recall then when I did some work, when I went through my studies, I remember reading about the fact that when he took his civil service entrance exam, that the examiner was just blown away because he got like 100% on the Eastern philosophy section. And he asked him, who was your teacher? And reportedly, Thomas Troward said, well, I just read up, I just researched. So he was a natural. And what he did was he then started to get connected when he retired from the civil service. He started to connect with the New Thought community. And so what they've got in this book is a transcript of him talking. So if you think about 100 years ago, the way in which people spoke, the language that they used, you know, within the first page or so of this book, you've got a sentence that's about 256 words. Okay, this is a book that's interesting, yet ironically, for me at the time, it was perfect, because where I was very much in the head. I was Mr. Clever Boots, I was Mr. Know-it-all, and I love the idea that I could have this mental process explained. And what Thomas Troward is doing is Thomas Troward provided the logic of the creative process for Ernest Holmes. If you're wondering why I'd be talking about him, Ernest Holmes wrote The Science of Mind. He had three major influences. Emerson gave him inspiration and nature. Quimby gave him mental healing, and Thomas Troward gave him the logic of the creative process. Ernest Holmes pulled that all together and then recognized that there was this creative mind. And that's the essence. That's the essence of how Ernest Holmes came to be here and writing The Science of Mind. Those were big influences. Well, it was an influence on for me because I ate it up. I loved it. But what I also, as I look back, I don't think I really realized at the time how much benefit there was to being in a class and to hearing the stories of others. Because what that was doing was that was giving me a chance to hear different perspectives of how they were taking this teaching and how they were making it their own. How they were relating to what they were hearing about in service, how they were relating what Thomas Troward was saying in terms of what Ernest Holmes was saying. And so as you hear the stories of other people and as you hear other people share their experience, that enriches your life. And when I started to realize as well, we would get together in little prayer pods and, you know, two or three of us, and we'd pray for each other each week, and we'd come back and we would hear about the manifestations that were unfolding. So then I got to see even deeper manifestations. So what I discovered was that coming to the service and hearing the Sunday message is a little bit like getting like a starter or the hors d'oeuvres. It's a taster, okay? But to really make it your own, you have to dive in. You have to, and I had to learn how to really apply this stuff. And that meant that I needed to understand it. And then I went through a series of events, one of which was a retreat that I went on for a week called the Circle of Love, and I just got done with the latest one. And that really opened up that channel between the head and the heart. And then I started to crack open. And at that point, I mean, I was going into practitioner studies, and that was exactly what I needed. So for me, community is one of the core elements, and connection are core elements of why I want a church. I've found that my journey has been a journey where I've gone through all sorts of adversity, all sorts of challenges to find myself at this point now. And that what I have as I'm living this life, this teaching and spiritual community has enriched me. It's provided a series of supports, some of them subtle, some of them obvious. The obvious supports can be when I go and sit down and do some work with a practitioner, because I need to borrow some consciousness for a while. And so I sit down and I do some spiritual coaching, and they support me. And less obvious supports are when we're connecting and supporting each other, whether that's at a garage sale, at fellowship, or in a class. So to me, I started to get very clear on that. So the idea of community is so essential. Why do I want a church? The idea then of spiritual nourishment comes up. Because if a minister gets up and they share a talk with you and you are inspired, and if you go into a service and there is music that makes you want to dance like no one's watching, and you come out of that service and you feel that something has happened, in my mind, the minimum for an experience in a center for spiritual living is you should feel better than when you entered. You should feel uplifted. You should feel inspired. You should feel that what is happening for you is an enrichment of your soul, that there is information, but more than that, there is wisdom. But more than that, there is a transformation that's unfolding for you, that spirit is being expressed. The role of the minister, from my point of view, the spiritual director, is to hold that field, is to hold that space so that when you come in, there is a field that influences you. There is a vibration. There is an energy. You feel it. And that when you leave, you are leaving lifted a little bit more than when you left. And the same thing happens in fellowship. The same thing happens when you come together in your fundraising events. And the same thing happens when you connect in class. Because inherently, human beings love to connect. We are not isolationists. We are not loners, believe it or not. And you know this. You've shown up today because there's something within you that does yearn for the idea of connection. And there's something within you that yearns for a bigger and stronger and clearer and more inspiring idea in your life. There's something within you that yearns to find that when you are moving and you are flowing through life, that you are more often reminded of the truth and the love of your being, and that everything and everyone is God. Something within you wants to shift from struggling to remember and berating yourself because you forgot on Monday morning to Saturday afternoon looking back at the week and going, wow, something's happening. You're yearning for that. So here's, when I think about the why do I want a church, the word purpose comes to mind. So in The Science of Mind, written by Ernest Holmes, there's on page 448, there's a section called The Purpose of the Science of Mind. And I was inspired to share this with you. So the whole purpose of the science of mind is to reconcile the apparent separation of the spiritual world, which must be perfect, with the material world, which appears imperfect. So think about it, right? There's this reconciliation between this perfect spiritual world that is God, that is individualized through you locally, that is the person, the material world. And it's about reconciling the apparent separation. Now, I'm going to say something that you might find a little challenging, okay? I used to be all into the saying, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, and I'm not anymore. And here's why. I'm a spiritual human being. Because to somehow separate the spiritual from a human experience is, and this is not that this is wrong, if from my particular understanding, it's the subtlest form of separation. As if a spiritual being is having a human experience. No, 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 no. I'm a spiritually human being having a spiritually human experience. Think about it. That is further reducing the distillation, the apparent separation of spiritual from the material. And it's so subtle, but that's my role as a minister of religious science. My role is to dive deeply into these teachings, because I'll tell you, this book and many books that are in this teaching, they are layers upon layers of mystical truth. And the ministry, from my point of view, is to delve so deeply that I find ways to present information that really, is truth, is the word of the one mind being expressed through and as me, and that I'm seeking to provide you with information that helps you reconcile that apparent separation. So he goes on, the spiritual world is the cause of the material. We are spiritual beings governed by mental law. So the spiritual world is cause. Okay, and that there's this mental law that governs. Now that's necessary. This mental law that's governing is providing some structure, whether you call it the law of attraction, the law of circulation, the law of nature, the law of physics. These are mechanical instruments and structure and framework. Just like your skeleton holds your body together, the muscles hold your skeleton and allow your body to be powered. That's the structure. And there is a law of physics and there is a law of nature that really is ensuring that your body behaves in this particular predictable way. That's why Western medicine can have that allopathic understanding, because the body acts predictably. That's why scientific research works, because to a certain extent, because they can see through experimentation predictable patterns. And then they can come up with medicines. The shortfalling of Western medicine is they think that that's it. It's not. It's a part of it, but it's not all of it. So we've got this mental law that's governing us. And now that he's got these words in capitals, because then he says, only that world can appear to us which we mentally perceive. Only that world can appear to us which we mentally perceive. Now, that line right there, you may or may not realize it, but it's absolutely dripping in mystical truth. In fact, the whole book is, but this is one of those paragraphs that really stands out. And this line here, only that world can appear to us which we mentally perceive, he's capitalized it for a reason. Whenever you're reading The Science of Mind and you get capitalized sentences, pay attention, because Ernest Holmes was no fool. He was a mystical man who was conveying the mystical truth as he understood it. And what he was saying in here is that the extent to which we perceive is our reality. Now, I remember when I came into the metaphysical world, do you remember that thing of this is all an illusion? No, it's not an illusion. It's as real as we perceive it to be. And that we have come here, soul is individualization, and soul's also used as that creative medium. But we've come here as this individualization of spirit projected onto this material plane, being body, right? Now, it is necessary for us to be able to perceive within a certain frequency. Even science is saying they're only registering 1/10 of 1% of the wavelength of light that's out there. So we can only perceive so much. So we go into community, we are on a spiritual journey to awaken to our spiritual magnificence so that we can perceive more. And one of the reasons why I am into ministry, one of the reasons why I am into church, one of the reasons why I'm into spiritual community is that they get to remind me through their perception, my perception is enriched. And as I get to perceive more, as I get to experience, there's a beautiful thing that's happening. Just to help you understand why, just one reason why you should appreciate why you are so magnificent and amazing in God's eyes. Not that God has a set of eyes, because God has an infinite perspective. God is infinity, but God cannot view experience through a finite set of eyes, through a finite perspective. Are you following me here? All right. God is not looking as an individual. God is looking at allness. Now, Thomas Troward gets into this, ironically, to bring that back. He gets very specifically into this, as does Charles Barker, as does Ernest Holmes. So God doesn't look through this finite perspective. So it takes our individual experience. It takes us living life and discovering the truth of ourselves. So he goes on to say, man's experience is the logical outcome of his inner vision. His horizon, or her horizon, is limited to the confines of his or her unconsciousness. So we can only see as far as we can perceive. And our consciousness is what limits us. And you see it all around you. When you look just at the news, there was a while when I really started to get into these teachings when I couldn't watch the news because I didn't have what I call the spiritual armor. I didn't have that groundedness where when I would see something happen, it would catch me up and it would take me into its story and I would get lost. I would find any moment of sweetness dissipate and I would find myself completely caught in the worldly clutches. And what was happening there was my ability to perceive was limited by my consciousness. But as I deepened my consciousness, I suddenly realized that the news in whatever form and the stories or that experiences or that events are expressions from individualizations, localizations of God, core personalities, so that the universe might be expanded. But do you not get that? That by having this individualized perspective, by taking our journey, by having that freedom of choice, we get to discover the truth of ourselves in our own unique and wonderful way. And in this particular lifetime, we may not get there. Now, hopefully we will. And I find with spiritual community, my experience is I'm moving in the right direction. Why? Because I feel good. My feelings are a reflection to me. They're an indicator, am I on the right path or not? There's an interesting thing. There's a saying that students in the 100 or foundations will always bring up. Change your thinking, change your life. What does that mean? My thoughts, they're creating all of this nonsense. It's like, well, let me put it another way. Change your beliefs, change your life. Well, what is a belief? A belief is a thought plus a feeling. Thought plus feelings equal manifestations. In fact, I would go one step further. Use your thinking to change your feelings and change your life. I describe the creative process like this. It's a rocket ship. The rocket ship's got a guidance system and it's got fuel, right? So what happens is the guidance system, look at that as your mind. Look at that as your thinking. Look at that as your intention. Now consider the fuel. That's the feelings. That's the passion. That's the belief. That's the conviction. That's the fervor. That's the enthusiasm. That is the energy that propels. Now, if you don't have intention, but if you've got a big bunch of energy, the rocket will take off. But who knows where it's going to end up? We got given this intention for the purpose of being able to use it. But we also need fuel. Don't think for a moment there's this, perhaps influenced by the puritanical values of when, the Mayflower came over to North America, that somehow church or spiritual service was supposed to be something of poverty, as if a minister wasn't supposed to have desires. Desires are there to provide the impulsion for us to want to create. So therefore, by wanting to create, we can have an individualized experience. But if we confuse effect with cause, we'll start with money. No, what we do is we get to the truth of our being and get to the cause of consciousness. So when I was watching the news, I was finding myself caught up into it. As I awoke, as I discovered the truth of myself, then I shifted into this mode of, I am going to offer a prayer. I'm going to hold a knowing and express a blessing, knowing that those involved in this experience have exactly what they need. Think about it. Anyone who is an aggressor, when you are witnessing the events in the world, you have a choice to buy into that mass hypnosis that we should all hate the aggressor. The aggressor is God. They've just forgotten. Their horizon is limited by the extent of their consciousness. This truth is either truth all the time or it isn't. And I know it's truth. And what I'm really clear about is the more profound the unwholesomeness of the aggressor, the more profoundly I'm called to know that they are God and offer a prayer to know that they have exactly what they need. Now, it's not for me to selfishly try and impose my values on what their journey should be, because I'm also about acceptance. So I accept that they're having the exact perfect journey that they need to. Why? Because their individualized experience is expanding consciousness, and thereby the universe expands, and that's the gift. That's the gift that we bring. We get to expand consciousness through our individualization. And Spirit is so glad. If you only knew that the force of light and love that is through and as you every moment, if you consciously connected to that, you'd be on cloud on. But if you were on cloud on, you wouldn't really get to have an individualized experience. You need to forget. And then there comes a point when suddenly you shift from, why is this happening to me? And the horizon of your consciousness expands. You transcend the old confines and you create new ones. You see further afield and you see further afield. And the further afield you see, the more you realize, the less you know. And that's wisdom. Wherever this consciousness lacks a true perspective, its outward expression will lack proper harmony. Every line is mystical truth. Wherever this consciousness lacks a true perspective, its outward expression will lack proper harmony. If you are feeling a low-level pain, a discontent, as some sort of disturbance in the Force. Anyone here a Star Wars fan? I love Star Wars. Feel a disturbance in the Force. If you feel a disturbance in the Force, if you feel some disharmony with community, with church, think about this. Wherever this consciousness lacks a true perspective, its outward expression will lack proper harmony. This is about what is the feeling within you. If you do not feel harmony, there's a teacher called Abraham Hicks. Anyone heard of him? I love him. And I'll tell you why I love him, because it's truth. What I love about Ernest Times, he said, the upper and the top, there's going to be all sorts of teachers in truth. And our teaching needs to expand. In fact, our teaching must be in alignment with science. And if it isn't, we need to rethink this teaching. Our teaching must be in alignment with the greatest teachers of the time, because there will be teachers who will come along and they will expand the confines of our horizon collectively. So what Abraham Hicks is saying is there's an emotional grid. And what I love about this is they're saying on the one end, the emotional grid is bliss, is freedom, is harmony, is joy, is peace, is power. And on the other end is despair, angst, anger, jealousy. And there's a grid, there's a continuum all the way through. You get that, right? So what I do is I'm looking, anytime I have a feeling where I feel harmony, peace, and bliss, whenever I make a choice, when I sat down and I was approached to consider being a spiritual director, the first thing I did was I went to meditation and I checked in after that meditation. How do I feel about this? Okay. I was on the positive side of neutral, but I had questions that spirit bubbled up. And so I engaged in a conversation. And then on last Thursday, I was up all night. I could not go to sleep. I meditated for about 3 hours. And then I was meditating and I wasn't meditating. I was trying to sleep. And then at 4 o'clock, I just bolt upright. And I just realized, and I sent an email to Kathy, and I had a whole bunch of stuff that just flowed. And I kind of knew through spirit what it would take. And I was in harmony. I was in deep clarity. There was something that was sweet that was unfolding. And I couldn't tell you the specific how, but that's not the point, because those are the clothes I'm wearing. That is the journey that I have taken to get me to this point, to think the way that I have. And that you know when you make a decision, when you are looking to how you feel, that's divine wisdom. Your ego is God. Think about it. The ego, that objective mind, that analyzing mind, you think that isn't God? You think that isn't within the infinite of God? Everything is within God. Don't try to dissolve the ego. Become the one that is aware and is the observer that transcends the jail that the ego is. Ram Dass talks about it. The ego is a jail. Transcend that. And so what you do is, I've learned how to listen as I'm making a decision to feelings that come up. Ego is divinity. The feelings that come up are divine messengers. They are telling me. I need to understand what they are telling me. And I found meditation, particularly for someone like myself, I've not been very good at being emotionally aware sometimes. As a child and as a man, I've been told, don't cry, hold your feelings in, stiff upper lip. I mean, what nonsense. Learn how to express and to listen to how you feel, and then learn how to cultivate your mind. So I've gotten very deeply into meditation. So May 2nd and 3rd, I'm going to be back here, and I'm putting on a half-day workshop. We've got a war day. We're going to make it a half day, 3 hours where we're going to do some meditation. And I'm going to teach you what I call sensory awareness meditation, which is something that I've been cultivating over the last probably 15 years, but the last few years in particular. And we look specifically at sensations and emotions, and it pairs beautifully with the science of mind. I've had people, I do it every week from 6 to 7 on Sundays at Metro, the center I'm currently at in Edmonton. And I've had practitioners and people coming out saying, like, wow, this has really added something. Why? Because when I use meditation, I'm learning how to be the master of my thinking. I'm learning how to be the observer, not the one that is being thought. And then when I meditate, when I allow myself to listen to the truth of who I am, when I feel the divinity that I am, when I'm moved, when I feel that life, when I feel that love, when I feel that presence, and when I have sharpened my mind, when I've disciplined my mind, because it takes practice. Because for the first 35 years, I had a whole bunch of garbage thrown at me, a whole bunch of false beliefs. It was perfect. I had cliches like, only the good die young and you have to work hard and all this nonsense, all this limitation, massive nonsense that's out there that we don't even consciously a lot of the time realize is going on. All of the agreements, all the stuff our parents are doing, the shame and the healing and the hurt that they're playing out. And we just soak that up, and it's like a lake. And above the lake is consciousness, and beneath the lake is subconsciousness, and we drop rocks in. But then at some point, we suddenly start to wake up and we connect that idea of the truth of who we are. And so he finishes here. This is why we are taught to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Since no one lives by proxy, but each unto himself, every individual must make the test in his own soul. We need to have this individual journey. But what I have found is that along the way, that spiritual community has given me so much support for my spiritual journey, for making the test in my own soul. Think about it. This is why I want church. So now this afternoon, when we come together, if you're here, I invite you to stay here from 1 till 3. I'm very curious about what the engagement here is, what people feel here in this community, why you want church. I want to hear about that. And then I'd like for us to come together to craft and draft what might be a purpose statement. So that should then this proceed to where I become your spiritual director, there will be this purpose statement that is being co-created. And what you'll get to see is a little bit of my leadership style, because I'm into that sort of shared leadership. I'm into that collaborative conversation. I want to understand, because each and every one of you, you are God. And you have intelligence that I don't have. You have wisdom that I don't have. You have power that I don't have. You have experience that I don't have. And I would love to bless you as you shine in the truth of who you are. That's why I want community. I love and bless you. Thank you. Beautiful. Okay. So now it's time for our offering. So